Hey guys, tonight we're stepping into the grimy, disease-ridden world of medieval prisons, where justice was swift, brutal, and often completely random. Picture yourself as an ordinary peasant in 1347. Maybe you've just been accused of stealing a loaf of bread, or perhaps someone simply doesn't like the way you looked at their wife. The smell of unwashed bodies and human waste already fills your nostrils as iron shackles bite into your wrists. You're about to discover that medieval imprisonment wasn't about rehabilitation or even punishment in any modern sense. It was simply a holding pen for society's unwanted. A place where people were stored like rotting grain until death, execution, or miraculous intervention freed them from their earthly torment. You probably won't survive this experience, but let's see how long you might last. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. Drop a comment below letting me know where you're listening from and what time it is in your corner of the world. I love seeing our little community spread across the globe. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. Your trouble begins on what seems like any other Tuesday morning in your small English village. You're hauling water from the communal well when the sheriff's men appear, their leather boots squelching through the mud that perpetually covers every street in your medieval world. They're looking for someone to blame for the missing grain from the Lord's storehouse. And unfortunately, you happen to be standing right there, bucket in hand, looking suspiciously like someone who might know where food could be found. This is how medieval justice often worked, not through careful investigation or evidence gathering, but through convenience and proximity. The concept of innocent until proven guilty wouldn't emerge for several more centuries. So when those rough hands grab your shoulders, you're already condemned in the eyes of the law. Medieval society operated on a presumption that accusations carried weight simply by existing. If someone bothered to accuse you, there must be some truth to it, right? This backwards logic meant that your fate was often sealed the moment someone pointed a finger in your direction. It's almost like medieval justice operated on the same principle as middle school rumors. Once someone starts talking, the truth becomes surprisingly irrelevant. You try to protest your innocence, but the sheriff's men aren't interested in your explanations. They've got quotas to meet and lords to satisfy, and you're just convenient enough to fill their daily requirement of arrested peasants. One of Thema, gap-toothed brute with arms like tree trunks, laughs at your desperate pleas and informs you that you'll have plenty of time to practice your story before the judge arrives. If you're lucky, that might be sometime within the next few months. Medieval court schedules made modern DMV wait times look positively efficient. The arrest process itself is surprisingly informal by modern standards. There are no Miranda rights, no phone calls to lawyers, no careful documentation of evidence. Instead, you're simply grabbed, bound with rough hemp rope that immediately starts chafing your wrists raw, and marched through the village streets while neighbors peek out from behind shutters. Some of them cross themselves and mutter prayers for your soul, while others seem almost relieved that the sheriff's attention has fallen on someone else this time. A few children throw small stones and rotting vegetables, because apparently even medieval kids understood the concept of kicking someone when they're down. Medieval law enforcement was a patchwork of local customs, royal decrees, and church regulations that often contradicted each other in spectacular fashion. Your village might operate under Saxon customs that hadn't been updated since before the Norman conquest, while the king's court followed entirely different rules that shifted with each monarch's whims. The church claimed jurisdiction over certain crimes, especially those involving moral offenses, while local lords maintained their own courts for matters affecting their property and peasants. Historians still argue whether the average medieval person understood what laws they were supposed to follow, given that legal codes changed frequently and were rarely written down in languages common people could read. As you're dragged toward the local manor house for a preliminary hearing, you begin to understand that medieval justice was less about truth and more about maintaining social order. The Lord needs someone to blame for his missing grain. The sheriff needs to demonstrate his effectiveness to keep his position. And you're simply the unlucky soul who happened to be in the wrong place at the wrong time. Your guilt or innocence is almost irrelevant to this equation. What matters is that someone pays the price, and that someone has turned out to be you. The walk to the manor house gives you time to contemplate just how thoroughly screwed you are. Medieval legal systems had no concept of public defenders or legal aid for the poor. If you couldn't afford to hire a clerk who understood Latin and legal procedures, you were expected to represent yourself in a language you probably couldn't read and according to rules no one had ever bothered to explain to you. It's like being asked to perform brain surgery with a butter knife while blindfolded, technically possible, but not something you'd want to bet your life on. The preliminary hearing takes place in the manor's great hall, a drafty stone chamber where your lord sits in a high-backed chair that serves as his throne of justice. He's currently more interested in his breakfast of roasted fowl than in your protestations of innocence, occasionally glancing up from his meal to nod at whatever the sheriff is telling him. This is the man who will decide whether you live or die, and he's treating your case with about as much attention as he'd give to choosing which tunic to wear. You notice he's got gravy on his chin, which somehow makes the entire situation feel even more surreal. Medieval trials were shockingly brief affairs, often lasting mere minutes rather than the hours or days we might expect today. Your lord listens to the accusation theft of grain from his storehouse and asks if anyone saw you commit this crime. When no witnesses step forward because, of course, you didn't actually steal anything, he simply shrugs and declares that your suspicious behavior and inability to account for your whereabouts yesterday evening constitute sufficient evidence for conviction. The entire trial takes about as long as it would take you to order a coffee at Starbucks. Except instead of getting caffeine, you're getting a life sentence. You want to point out that you were home with your family yesterday evening, just like every other evening of your life. But medieval courts weren't particularly interested in alibis from peasants. Your word carries virtually no weight against the sheriff's accusation, and your family's testimony would be dismissed as obviously biased. The legal system assumes that people in positions of authority, sheriffs, lords, church officials, are inherently more trustworthy than common folk like yourself. It's a system designed by the powerful to protect the powerful, with everyone else serving as expendable pawns. The sentencing phase is even more arbitrary than the trial. Your lord could order immediate execution, public flogging, monetary compensation, or imprisonment, depending entirely on his mood, what he had for breakfast, the weather, or whether his wife was speaking to him that morning. Some medieval lords were known for their merciful dispositions, while others delighted in creative punishments that would serve as warnings to other potential troublemakers. Unfortunately for you, your particular lord seems to be having a bad morning, and he's decided that a lengthy prison sentence will teach both you and your neighbors a lesson about respecting his property. Medieval prisons served multiple functions beyond simple punishment. They were holding facilities for people awaiting trial, debtors who couldn't pay their obligations, political prisoners who posed threats to local authorities, and convicted criminals serving sentences that might last anywhere from months to the remainder of their natural lives. You're now officially a member of this diverse and desperate community, though you won't fully understand what that means until you experience medieval prison life firsthand. It's like joining the world's worst social club, except membership is involuntary and the annual dues are paid in suffering. The concept of proportional punishment, making the punishment fit the crime, was virtually non-existent in medieval justice. A person caught stealing bread might receive the same prison sentence as someone convicted of assault, while political crimes against local nobles often carried punishments far exceeding their actual harm to society. Your grain theft conviction, despite being based on absolutely no evidence whatsoever, could keep you imprisoned for years or even decades, assuming you survived that long. Medieval justice had all the consistency of a weather forecast and about half the accuracy. One particularly bizarre aspect of medieval legal proceedings was the concept of trial by ordeal, though thankfully your case doesn't seem headed in that direction. Some accused criminals were expected to prove their innocence by carrying red-hot iron bars, plunging their hands into boiling water, or being thrown into rivers to see if they floated. The theory was that God would protect the innocent and punish the guilty through miraculous intervention. Historians still debate whether medieval people genuinely believed these methods worked or simply used them as convenient ways to eliminate unwanted community members, but the results were often fatal regardless of the underlying motivation. Your Lord's Court also demonstrates the intersection of secular and religious authority that characterized medieval justice. While he's sentencing you to prison time, he makes a point of mentioning that your crimes are not only against his property but also against God's commandment not to steal. This theological dimension means that your punishment serves both earthly and divine purposes, being imprisoned to protect the Lord's interests and to cleanse your soul through suffering. It's a two-for-one deal on justice that you definitely didn't ask for. As the guards prepare to escort you to your new accommodations, you catch a glimpse of the great hall's tapestries depicting scenes of noble hunts and glorious battles. These images of medieval romance and chivalry seem almost mocking now that you understand how arbitrary and brutal the reality of medieval life can be. The same society that produced elaborate codes of honor for knights and nobles had no qualms about condemning peasants to slow death in dungeon cells based on nothing more than convenient timing and social prejudice. The irony isn't lost on you that the grain you allegedly stole was probably worth less than the cost of keeping you imprisoned for a single month. Medieval economic priorities often defied basic logic, with authorities willing to spend enormous resources on punishment while allowing the underlying problems that drove people to desperation to persist unchecked. It's like treating a broken leg by amputating the patient's arm, technically a medical intervention, but probably not the most effective approach. Your sentencing is complete, your fate sealed by a process that took less time than it would take you to eat a proper meal. You're no longer a free person with rights and possessions, but a condemned prisoner whose survival now depends on factors entirely beyond your control. The guards are already reaching for your arms, their grip surprisingly firm despite the casual way they've been observing your trial. They've done this before, probably many times, and they know exactly what comes next even if you don't. The iron manacles clamp around your wrists with a finality that echoes through the stone corridors of the manor house. You're no longer just an accused peasantry officially property of the crown, or in this case, your local lord's justice system. The guards who now control your immediate future are a motley crew of men who found employment in one of medieval society's few growth industries, human misery management. They grunt instructions in a dialect you can barely understand, punctuated with shoves and the occasional crack of a leather whip against stone walls to keep you moving forward. The sound reverberates through the corridors like a promise of what's to come. Your journey to prison begins with what medieval authorities euphemistically called transportation, though it bears no resemblance to any modern concept of humane prisoner transfer. You're chained not just at the wrists, but also at the ankles, with heavy iron links that force you to shuffle rather than walk normally. The weight of the metal is immediately exhausting, and you haven't even left the manor grounds yet. These aren't the clean, precisely fitted restraints you might see in movies theory, crude iron bands that were hammered into shape by the village blacksmith, with rough edges that immediately begin abrading your skin. The metal is cold against your flesh, and you can already feel the beginning of what will become permanent scars. The chain gang you're about to join is already assembled in the manor's courtyard, a sorry collection of humanity that represents the bottom tier of medieval society. There's a poacher who allegedly killed one of the Lord's deer, his face bearing the marks of a recent beating. A woman accused of adultery stands with her head bowed, her hair roughly shorn as part of her preliminary punishment. An old man whose debts to the local miller have finally caught up with him wheezes with each breath, clearly in poor health. A young boy who couldn't have been more than 14, charged with stealing apples from a monastery orchard, looks around with wide, terrified eyes. You're chained together like a human freight train, each person's movement affecting everyone else in the line. Medieval prisoner transport was a public spectacle designed to serve multiple purposes beyond simply moving bodies from point A to point B. The authorities wanted everyone to see what happened to people who broke the rules, creating a mobile morality play that would hopefully deter other potential criminals. Your slow parade through the village streets becomes an impromptu carnival of public shame, with townspeople gathering to witness your humiliation and remind themselves how much worse their own lives could become. It's like being the star of a reality show that nobody wants to watch, but everyone feels compelled to observe. The crowd that assembles to watch your procession is surprisingly diverse, representing nearly every social class except the nobility, who are presumably too refined to engage in such crude entertainment. Merchants abandon their stalls, craftsmen set down their tools, and even priests emerge from churches to observe the wages of sin being displayed in living color. Children are lifted onto parents' shoulders for better views, as if this were some sort of twisted holiday parade celebrating the triumph of justice over lawlessness. The medieval equivalent of going viral, except instead of getting famous, you're getting pelted with garbage. The projectiles begin flying almost immediately. Rotten vegetables are the ammunition of choice, though you quickly discover that medieval crowds aren't particularly picky about what they throw at condemned prisoners. Spoiled eggs explode against your face and clothing, filling your nostrils with the sulfurous stench of decay. Moldy bread bounces off your shoulders, while kitchen scraps and animal waste create a slippery mess around your shuffling feet. One particularly enterprising spectator has brought a basket of turnips that have gone soft with age, launching them with surprising accuracy at your head. Another throws what you hope is mud but suspect might be something considerably worse. The guards make no effort to protect you from this baragine fact. They seem to encourage it by slowing the procession whenever the crowd gets particularly enthusiastic about their target practice. This isn't just transportation. It's the first installment of your punishment, a public humiliation designed to strip away whatever dignity you might have retained from your brief trial. You're learning that medieval justice believed in getting its money's worth from every convicted criminal, like buying a torture package deal with multiple components included at no extra charge. The woman chained next to you, the one convicted of adultery, whispers that she's made this journey before. Apparently, medieval justice sometimes involved multiple public shaming sessions for repeat offenders, with each subsequent trip featuring escalating levels of community participation. She warns you to keep your mouth shut and your head down, advice that seems eminently practical given the current circumstances. Her face bears scars that suggest previous crowds were even less restrained than today's audience. She also mentions that the prison you're heading to has a reputation that makes grown men weep, though she doesn't elaborate on the details. Your route takes you through the village's main thoroughfare, past the market square where you've purchased goods for your family in happier times. The same merchants who once smiled and exchanged pleasantries when you had coins to spend now watch your passage with expressions ranging from smugness to pity. The baker whose bread you allegedly stole, though you've never stolen anything in your life, stands in his doorway with his arms crossed, nodding with satisfaction at what he probably sees as long overdue justice. His wife stands beside him, shaking her head as if she'd predicted this outcome all along. The physical toll of this journey is immediately apparent. The iron shackles create a shuffling gait that's both exhausting and humiliating, forcing you to take tiny steps while trying to coordinate your movement with the other prisoners in your chain gang. The weight of the metal pulls constantly at your wrists and ankles, creating a burning sensation that you know will only get worse as the miles accumulate. Medieval metallurgy wasn't particularly concerned with prisoner comfort, and these restraints were designed for security rather than wearability. The chains connecting you to your fellow prisoners are just long enough to allow movement but short enough to ensure that any attempt at independent action affects everyone else in the line. As you shuffle through the village outskirts, the crowd begins to thin, though dedicated followers continue trailing your procession like medieval paparazzi documenting a celebrity scandal. Some of them carry crude musical instruments, drums, flutes, and rattles, creating a discordant soundtrack for your journey that transforms the entire experience into a nightmarish festival. It's like being the unwilling star of the world's worst parade, complete with a marching band that's tone-deaf and malicious. Children run alongside the procession, chanting rhymes about prisoners and thieves that suggest this sort of entertainment has inspired its own folk traditions. The road to the regional prison is little more than a muddy track that becomes increasingly treacherous as your group moves farther from civilization. Medieval infrastructure was notoriously poor, with most roads being simple dirt paths that turned into swamps whenever it rained. Your shuffling progress kicks up clouds of dust that mix with the rotting vegetables still clinging to your clothes, creating a paste-like substance that makes breathing difficult and visibility poor. The guards occasionally crack their whips over your heads to maintain pace, though at the speed you're capable of moving, their urgency seems somewhat misplaced. Medieval prisoner transport typically took place during daylight hours for security reasons, but this meant you were exposed to whatever weather conditions happened to prevail during your journey. If it rained, you got soaked to the bone while trudging through mud that made walking even more difficult. If the sun shone brightly, you roasted in your heavy clothing and iron restraints with no protection from the heat. Today seems determined to provide you with the full medieval weather experience, alternating between light drizzle and humid sunshine that creates a personal climate of maximum discomfort. The guards have cloaks and hats. You have chains and misery. Historians still argue whether these public spectacles actually deterred crime or simply provided entertainment for populations that had few other diversions available. What's clear is that the practice served important social functions, allowing communities to collectively express their disapproval of antisocial behavior while reinforcing shared values about property, authority, and moral conduct. You've become a living lesson in social studies, though probably not the kind you would have volunteered for. The irony isn't lost on you that your alleged crime-stealing grain was probably motivated by the same poverty that's now making your punishment a source of entertainment for people who have nothing better to do. The guards accompanying your procession are a study in medieval law enforcement efficiency, which is to say they're about as professional as a group of tavern bouncers who've been drinking on the job. They carry an assortment of weapons, clubs, short swords, and crossbows, but seem more interested in chatting among themselves than monitoring their prisoners. One of them periodically counts heads to make sure nobody has somehow escaped while chained to a dozen other people, displaying the kind of thoroughness that probably explains why medieval crime rates were actually pretty manageable. Their conversation topics range from complaints about their wages to detailed descriptions of what they plan to do with various tavern wenches, creating a running commentary that would be inappropriate in any professional setting. Halfway through your journey, the procession stops at a roadside tavern where the guards decide they need refreshment. You and your fellow prisoners are left standing in the courtyard, still chained together, while your captors disappear inside for what sounds like an increasingly boisterous drinking session. The tavern keeper's wife takes pity on your group and brings out a bucket of water and a ladle, allowing each prisoner a few precious sips. It's the first kindness you've experienced since this ordeal began, and you find yourself almost weeping with gratitude for this small gesture of humanity. She also provides a crust of bread for each prisoner, though she's careful to avoid eye contact and whispers that she could get in trouble for showing mercy to condemned criminals. The delay gives you time to really look at your fellow prisoners and contemplate the randomness of medieval justice. The old debtor explains that he owes money to 3 different creditors and can't possibly pay them all, making prison his only refuge from demands he can never meet. The young apple thief turns out to be an orphan who was simply trying to eat something after going 3 days without food. The poacher killed a deer to feed his sick wife, knowing full well that the penalty could be severe but calculating that watching her starve was worse than risking imprisonment. The adulteress claims her husband arranged her conviction to get rid of her without paying for a divorce, though medieval divorce laws were so complicated that her story is entirely plausible. These aren't hardened criminals or dangerous sociopaths. They're ordinary people who made desperate choices or simply had the misfortune to be in the wrong place when authorities needed someone to blame for various problems. Medieval society created the conditions that drove people to these acts, then punished them severely for responding to those conditions in predictable ways. It's like deliberately creating a maze with no exit, then condemning the rats for getting lost. The system seems designed to produce criminals rather than prevent crime, ensuring a steady supply of prisoners to fill the expanding network of medieval detention facilities. When the guards finally emerge from the tavern, they're noticeably less steady on their feet but no less enthusiastic about completing their mission. The remainder of your journey takes on a surreal quality as your slightly drunk escorts alternately sing tavern songs and shout threats at anyone who might be thinking about attempting an escape. Not that escape seems particularly feasible when you're chained to 11 other people and moving at roughly the speed of continental drift. One guard has apparently won money gambling and celebrates by occasionally tossing coins at beggars along the roadside, a display of generosity that stands in stark contrast to his treatment of the prisoners under his care. The countryside through which you're traveling becomes increasingly desolate as you move farther from populated areas. Medieval prisons were typically located in remote locations for security reasons, but this isolation also served to reinforce the sense that prisoners were being removed from civilized society entirely. The landscape consists mainly of scrubland and rocky outcroppings that provide little in the way of comfort or beauty. Occasional ravens follow your procession, as if they've learned to associate these prisoner transports with future feeding opportunities. The afternoon sun beats down mercilessly, and the combination of heavy iron restraints, rotting food residue, and accumulated sweat creates a personal atmosphere that would challenge even medieval standards of hygiene. Your fellow prisoners are suffering similarly, with several showing signs of heat exhaustion and dehydration. The guards seem oblivious to these health concerns, maintaining their pace regardless of whether their charges are capable of keeping up. Medieval prisoner transport operated on the assumption that anyone strong enough to commit crimes was strong enough to survive punishment, regardless of evidence to the contrary. As evening approaches, you begin to understand that this journey serves purposes beyond simple transportation. The physical exhaustion, public humiliation, and gradual removal from familiar surroundings all combine to break down your psychological defenses and prepare you for what lies ahead. By the time you reach the prison, you'll already be softened up for whatever horrors await inside those stone walls. It's like a conditioning process designed to transform free citizens into compliant prisoners before they even enter their cells. The prison finally comes into view as the sun begins its descent toward the horizon, a massive stone structure that dominates the landscape like a man-made mountain of despair. Even from a distance, you can see that this isn't just a building, it's a statement about power, authority, and what happens to people who challenge the established order. The walls rise from the earth like cliffs, with small windows that look more like arrow slits than any concession to prisoner comfort or human needs. Smoke rises from various points within the complex, though whether from cooking fires or more sinister purposes isn't immediately clear. Your arrival at the prison gates marks the end of one nightmare and the beginning of another. The guards pound on heavy wooden doors reinforced with iron bands, creating echoes that seem to reverberate from deep within the stone walls. When the doors finally swing open, they reveal a courtyard that looks like something from your worst dreams, a space where sunlight struggles to reach the ground and shadows seem to have weight and substance. The smell that emerges from within is indescribable, a mixture of human waste, decay, and despair that makes the rotting vegetables still clinging to your clothes seem almost pleasant by comparison. The massive wooden doors slam shut behind you with a sound that seems to echo not just through the stone courtyard, but through your very soul. You're now inside the belly of the medieval beast, a place where the normal rules of human society have been suspended in favor of something far more primitive and brutal. The first thing that hits you isn't the sight of your new home, but the nauseating cocktail of human waste, rotting straw, unwashed bodies, and something else you can't quite identify but instinctively know you don't want to. It's the smell of despair made manifest, thick enough to taste and impossible to escape. The prison courtyard is a rectangle of packed earth surrounded by stone walls that rise so high they block out most of the sky, creating a perpetual twilight even during daylight hours. What little sunlight does penetrate this medieval hellscape reveals details you immediately wish you couldn't see. The ground is littered with straw that was probably fresh sometime during the previous century, now blackened with substances you prefer not to contemplate. Prisoners in various stages of decay and desperation shuffle around the space like the walking dead, their hollow eyes tracking your arrival with the same interest they might show a new shipment of rats. Your chains are finally removed by a prison guard who seems to take particular pleasure in the process, yanking the iron bands from your raw wrists with unnecessary force. The relief of being freed from the weight is immediately overshadowed by the realization that you're now completely at the mercy of this place and its inhabitants. At least while chained, you had some sense of your status in the system. Now you're just another piece of human debris waiting to be processed and stored. The head jailer emerges from a doorway cut into the stone wall, a massive man whose appearance suggests he was specifically bred for this profession. His arms are the size of tree trunks. His face bears scars that speak of countless violent encounters, and his eyes hold the kind of dead expression that comes from years of watching human suffering without developing any emotional response to it. He looks you up and down like a butcher evaluating a side of beef, clearly calculating how much trouble you're likely to cause and how much entertainment you might provide. Medieval prison administration was surprisingly bureaucratic for such a barbaric institution. You're subjected to what passes for an intake process, though it bears little resemblance to modern booking procedures. Your name is scratched onto a piece of parchment with a quill that's seen better decades, along with your alleged crime and the length of your sentence, assuming anyone remembers to keep track of such details. The clerk performing this task is a thin, nervous man who keeps glancing at the head jailer as if expecting to be struck at any moment. His handwriting is barely legible, which probably doesn't matter since most people here can't read anyway. The orientation process consists mainly of the head jailer explaining the rules of survival in terms that would make a tavern brawler blush. You're informed that food is provided twice daily, though the definition of food is apparently quite flexible. Water comes from a well in the center of the courtyard that you're advised not to examine too closely. Fighting is discouraged but not prohibited, since it provides entertainment for the guards and helps reduce overcrowding through natural selection. Escape attempts are punishable by immediate execution, assuming you survive long enough to be caught. Your cell assignment is determined by a combination of your alleged crime, your ability to pay bribes, and whatever whim happens to strike the head jailer at the moment. Since you're a peasant convicted of theft with no money for bribes, you're destined for what the guards euphemistically call general population, which translates to the worst accommodations this medieval nightmare has to offer. You're escorted across the courtyard by a guard who seems to enjoy watching prisoners step in the various puddles and piles that dot the landscape, chuckling whenever someone slips or gags at a particularly offensive smell. The entrance to your new home is a wooden door reinforced with iron bands, hanging from hinges that screech like tortured souls whenever it opens. The sound alone is enough to make you reconsider every life choice that led to this moment. But there's no going back now. The door swings open to reveal a chamber that defies your worst expectations of medieval prison conditions, somehow managing to be even more horrific than your imagination had prepared you for. Your cell is roughly 20 feet square, with stone walls that weep moisture constantly and a ceiling so low that tall prisoners have to stoop continuously. The floor consists of stones fitted together with mortar that has long since crumbled away, creating uneven surfaces perfect for tripping and injuring yourself in the perpetual darkness. There are no windows in the traditional sense, just a few narrow slits high in the walls that provide barely enough light to see your immediate surroundings and certainly not enough to read by. assuming you could read and had anything to read. The most shocking aspect of your new accommodations isn't the physical conditions, but the number of people crammed into this impossibly small space. You count at least 30 other prisoners sharing these quarters, though the exact number is difficult to determine since many of them remain motionless in dark corners and might be either sleeping or dead. Medieval prisons operated on the principle that human beings could be stored like grain in a warehouse, with little regard for comfort, hygiene, or basic survival needs. Historians still argue whether medieval prison overcrowding was intentional policy designed to increase suffering or simply the result of practical considerations like limited space and unlimited criminal populations. What's clear is that the authorities showed little interest in addressing the problem, apparently believing that discomfort was an essential component of proper punishment. Your new roommates represent a cross-section of medieval society's unwanted elements, from petty thieves to political dissidents to people whose only crime was being in the wrong place when someone needed a scapegoat. The sleeping arrangements in your cell follow a strict hierarchy that becomes apparent within minutes of your arrival. The area nearest the door is controlled by the most dangerous prisoners, who use their proximity to the exit as both a strategic advantage and a status symbol. The center of the room is occupied by mid-level criminals and long-term residents who've established their positions through violence or cunning. The far corners are reserved for the weakest prisoners, the newly arrived, and those who are too sick or injured to defend better territory. Your introduction to this medieval social structure comes courtesy of a prisoner who introduces himself as Thomas the Terrible, though his appearance suggests the nickname might be ironic. He's a thin, weaselly man with missing teeth and nervous tics who claims to be serving time for highway robbery, though you suspect his actual crimes were probably less impressive than his title suggests. He offers to show you around your new home and explain the unwritten rules that govern daily life, though you quickly realize this orientation comes with a price that will be collected later. The toilet facilities in your cell consist of a single bucket in one corner that clearly hasn't been emptied in recent memory. The smell emanating from this medieval bathroom is so overwhelming that breathing through your mouth becomes a survival necessity, though that creates its own problems since you can actually taste the air in here. Medieval sanitation was primitive under the best circumstances, but prison sanitation was essentially non-existent, operating on the principle that convicted criminals had forfeited their right to basic human dignity. Your first night in the stone hell reveals the true horror of medieval prison life. As darkness falls, the temperature drops dramatically, and you discover that your cell has no heating system beyond the collective body heat of 30 unwashed human beings pressed together in a space designed for perhaps 6 people. The cold stone walls seem to actively draw warmth from your body, while the thin layer of rotting straw on the floor provides no insulation from the frigid stones beneath. Sleep becomes a strategic challenge rather than a natural process. You need to find a position that protects you from both the cold and your fellow prisoners, some of whom have been driven to desperation by their circumstances. The constant sounds of coughing, moaning, and whispered conversations create a soundtrack of misery that continues throughout the night. Occasionally, someone screams in their sleep, though whether from nightmares or more immediate concerns isn't always clear. The darkness in your cell is absolute, broken only by occasional flickers of torchlight from the corridor outside when guards make their rounds. This sensory deprivation creates a disorienting environment where time becomes meaningless and reality starts to feel negotiable. You begin to understand how extended imprisonment could drive people mad, even without the additional stresses of overcrowding, poor sanitation, and constant fear of violence from fellow inmates. Your first morning in prison begins with the sound of keys rattling in the corridor outside, followed by the screech of hinges as cell doors throughout the building open for the morning feeding. The guards who appear at your door look like they've been specifically selected for their ability to intimidate prisoners through pure physical presence. They carry clubs and wear leather armor that suggests they expect trouble from the people they're supposed to be feeding, which probably isn't an unreasonable precaution given the circumstances. The breakfast service consists of guards ladling what can generously be called gruel from a large pot into wooden bowls that are passed around to prisoners. The substance bears no resemblance to any food you've previously encountered, having the consistency of thin mud and a smell that suggests it might have been edible at some point in the distant past. Thomas the Terrible explains that complaining about the food is discouraged, since the alternative to eating this slop is not eating at all, and hunger can make even the most disgusting meals seem appealing. Your fellow prisoners attack their morning meal with an enthusiasm that suggests they've learned to appreciate any source of nutrition, regardless of its palatability. Some of them have been here long enough to develop techniques for making the gruel more tolerable, like mixing it with water from the courtyard well to dilute the flavor, or eating it quickly to minimize the time it spends in contact with their taste buds. It's like watching a masterclass in survival adaptation, except the subject matter is medieval prison cuisine. The social dynamics of your cell become clearer as you observe the feeding process. Stronger prisoners demand larger portions and first access to the food pot, while weaker inmates wait patiently for whatever remains. Some prisoners have formed alliances that allow them to pool their resources and protect each other from more aggressive cellmates. Others have adopted strategies of complete submission, hoping that appearing harmless will keep them safe from violence. Everyone has developed some system for survival, though none of these systems seem particularly effective at ensuring long-term health or safety. Your first full day in this medieval nightmare is just beginning, and you're already discovering that the journey to get here was probably the easy part of your current ordeal. The prison operates according to rules that make the arbitrary nature of medieval justice seem almost reasonable by comparison. You're learning that survival here requires skills and knowledge that no amount of peaceful village life could have prepared you for, and the education process is likely to be both brutal and potentially fatal. The hollow gnawing in your stomach becomes your constant companion within days of arriving at this medieval monument to human misery. You quickly discover that the morning gruel you found so disgusting on your first day represents the highlight of the prison's culinary offerings, and even that meager sustenance comes with strings attached that you're only beginning to understand. Medieval prison food systems operated on principles that would make modern prison reform advocates weep, combining deliberate cruelty with stunning incompetence to create an environment where starvation was always just one missed meal away. Your education in prison economics begins when you watch a new Aravala merchant convicted of fraud attempt to negotiate with the guards for better food. He produces a small leather purse from his clothing and begins counting out silver coins, explaining that he's willing to pay for decent meals during his incarceration. The head guard examines the coins with professional interest, nods approvingly, and pockets the entire purse before informing the merchant that he'll now receive the same slop as everyone else. But the guards will remember his generosity when considering whether to let him starve completely. This interaction reveals the fundamental truth about medieval prison sustenance. Food isn't provided as a basic human right, but as a privilege that must be constantly negotiated, purchased, or fought for. The authorities assume that prisoners' families will supplement the official rations with regular deliveries of bread, cheese, meat, and other actual food items. If your family happens to be too poor to afford these contributions, or if they live too far away to make regular visits, or if they've simply decided you're better off dead, then you're expected to slowly waste away while contemplating your crimes. The official prison diet consists of what the guards euphemistically call bread and water, though both terms require significant linguistic flexibility to apply to the substances actually provided. The bread is a dark, dense mass that seems to have been made from sawdust, crushed insects, and whatever grain was too moldy for human consumption. It arrives in chunks that could serve double duty as building materials, requiring significant effort to break into pieces small enough to chew. The water comes from the courtyard well, which you've learned not to examine too closely after seeing things floating in it that definitely weren't there when it rained. Your fellow prisoners have developed an elaborate system for supplementing these official rations through various forms of entrepreneurship, most of which would be illegal under normal circumstances but seem perfectly reasonable when the alternative is starvation. Some inmates work as servants for wealthier prisoners, cleaning their sleeping areas and performing other menial tasks in exchange for shares of food packages sent by families. Others offer entertainment services, telling stories or singing songs to help pass the endless hours of imprisonment, earning crusts of bread as payment for their performances. The most successful prison entrepreneur in your cell is a man called Fat William, though his nickname seems increasingly ironic given the general state of malnutrition that characterizes your living quarters. He's managed to establish himself as a middleman between prisoners and the outside world, arranging for family members to smuggle in food and other contraband in exchange for various services. His business model is essentially medieval prison Amazon, except delivery times are measured in weeks rather than days, and customer service consists mainly of threats of physical violence. Fat William's operation demonstrates the corruption that permeates every aspect of medieval prison administration. The guards not only tolerate his activities but actively participate in them, taking cuts of his profits in exchange for looking the other way when smuggled goods enter the prison. Some guards have even become business partners, using their access to the outside world to expand William's operations beyond the prison walls. It's like a medieval version of organized crime, except it's happening inside a building that's supposed to represent law and order. Your own position in this prison economy is precarious, since you have no family wealth to draw upon and no particular skills that other prisoners value highly enough to trade for food. The few coins you possessed when arrested were confiscated during your intake processing, officially to pay for your room and board but actually to line the pockets of prison officials. You're learning that medieval justice wasn't just blind, it was also incredibly hungry for any money it could extract from its victims. The feeding schedule in your prison follows a routine that seems designed to maximize suffering while maintaining just enough nutrition to keep prisoners alive for extended periods. The morning gruel arrives shortly after dawn, ladled into communal bowls that are shared among multiple prisoners. The evening meal consists of the same substance, though it's often colder and more congealed by the time it reaches your cell. On Sundays, the prison sometimes provides what the guards call a feast, slightly larger portions of the same inedible slop, occasionally supplemented with scraps of meat that might have been edible before spending several days in the prison kitchen. Historians still argue whether medieval prison food was deliberately designed to torture inmates or simply reflected the general incompetence of institutional cooking during this period. What's clear is that the nutritional content of these meals was insufficient to maintain human health for extended periods, leading to widespread malnutrition, scurvy, and various diseases associated with dietary deficiencies. The authorities seem to view slow starvation as an acceptable component of criminal punishment, operating on the theory that physical suffering would encourage moral reformation. Your first week in prison introduces you to the complex social dynamics that govern food distribution within your cell. The strongest prisoners claim the largest portions and the choicest bits of whatever passes for food, while weaker inmates survive on scraps and leftovers. Some prisoners have formed alliances that allow them to pool their resources and share whatever food they can obtain, while others operate as solo entrepreneurs, hoarding their resources and trading strategically for maximum personal advantage. The prison kitchen, which you glimpse during your second week when assigned to work detail, reveals the source of your culinary misery. It's a smoke-filled chamber dominated by massive cauldrons that look like they haven't been properly cleaned since the Norman conquest. The cooks are prisoners who've earned these coveted positions through various combinations of bribery, violence, and political maneuvering. They control not only food preparation but also food distribution, making them some of the most powerful people in the entire prison hierarchy. Working in the kitchen provides insights into the prison's supply chain that explain why the food is so consistently terrible. Most ingredients arrive already spoiled, having been rejected by other institutions or purchased at discount prices from merchants who couldn't sell them elsewhere. Vegetables are typically rotten, Meat comes from animals that died of disease rather than proper slaughter. And grain often contains substantial percentages of debris, insects, and substances that definitely aren't grain. The cooks do their best with these materials, but their best still produces results that would be rejected by starving dogs. The water situation in your prison is almost as dire as the food problem, though it receives less attention because people can survive longer without decent water than without any food at all. The courtyard well provides the primary water source for drinking, cooking, and what passes for sanitation in this medieval nightmare. The water has a brownish color and a taste that suggests it might be contaminated with substances that were never intended for human consumption. Some prisoners swear they've seen fish swimming in the well, though whether these are actual fish or hallucinations caused by malnutrition remains an open question. Your stomach begins adapting to its new reality within the first month, shrinking to accommodate smaller food portions and developing tolerance for substances that would have made you violently ill during your previous life as a free person. This biological adaptation process is both a blessing and a curse. It allows you to survive on the prison's meager rations, but it also represents a fundamental change in your body's expectations and capabilities. You're becoming a different person, physically as well as psychologically, shaped by the brutal environment you're forced to inhabit. The psychological effects of chronic hunger become apparent as you watch fellow prisoners undergo personality changes driven by constant food insecurity. Men who might have been generous and community-minded in their previous lives become calculating and selfish when every scrap of food represents potential survival. Acts of kindness become rare and precious, while betrayals over food scraps occur with depressing regularity. The prison environment systematically destroys the social bonds that hold human communities together, replacing cooperation with competition and trust with suspicion. Some prisoners develop obsessive behaviors around food, carefully rationing their meager portions and eating with ritualistic precision to maximize both nutrition and psychological satisfaction. Others abandon all restraint, consuming their entire daily ration immediately upon receiving it and then spending the rest of the day in hungry desperation. Both strategies have their advantages and disadvantages, but neither provides a solution to the fundamental problem of insufficient nutrition in an environment that demands significant physical and mental energy for simple survival. The black market in food items reveals the desperate creativity that emerges when human beings are pushed to their biological limits. Prisoners trade personal possessions, sexual favors, information about escape plans, and promises of future payments for additional food. Some inmates sell their own clothing or bedding materials to purchase extra rations, calculating that short-term nutrition is worth the risk of freezing during cold nights. Others offer to perform dangerous tasks or take blame for infractions committed by other prisoners in exchange for shares of contraband food packages. Your fellow prisoners include several men who've been incarcerated for multiple years, and their physical condition provides a sobering preview of your own likely future. Chronic malnutrition has left them skeletal and weak, with sunken eyes and hollow cheeks that make them look decades older than their actual ages. Their teeth are loose or missing entirely, their hair has fallen out in patches, and their skin has developed a grayish pallor that suggests their bodies are slowly consuming themselves to stay alive. They represent living proof that the medieval prison system was designed not just to punish criminals but to gradually kill them through systematic neglect. The guards who oversee this nutritional nightmare seem genuinely puzzled by prisoners' complaints about food quality and quantity. From their perspective, convicted criminals have forfeited their right to comfortable living conditions, and providing any food at all represents generous treatment that prisoners should appreciate rather than criticize. They view hunger as a natural consequence of criminal behavior, operating on the medieval assumption that physical suffering would lead to spiritual redemption and moral improvement. Your education in prison hunger politics concludes with the realization that food has become the primary currency in your new world, more valuable than money or personal possessions because it directly determines whether you live or die. Every meal represents a small victory against the forces trying to kill you, while every missed meal brings you closer to joining the growing number of prisoners who simply lie down one day and never get up again. The medieval prison system has successfully reduced human existence to its most basic biological imperatives, stripping away everything that makes life meaningful except the desperate struggle to consume enough calories to see another sunrise. The first time you see a fellow prisoner die, it happens so quietly that you almost miss it entirely. Old Henrik, the debtor who'd been chained next to you during the journey here, simply stops breathing one Tuesday morning while sitting against the cell wall. He doesn't cry out or struggle, he just exhales one final time and never inhales again, his body finally surrendering to the collection of ailments that medieval prison life had systematically inflicted upon him. The other prisoners barely react to this development, stepping around his corpse with the casual indifference you might show a piece of furniture that's been moved to an inconvenient location. It's like death has become so common here that it's lost any shock value, reduced to just another daily inconvenience to navigate around. Death in medieval prisons wasn't just common, it was the primary method by which overcrowding problems resolved themselves. The guards don't bother removing Henrik's body until the following day, leaving you to spend an entire night sleeping within arm's reach of a decomposing corpse. When they finally drag him away, they do so with the same enthusiasm they might show for hauling garbage, grabbing his ankles and pulling him across the stone floor like a sack of grain. His departure creates exactly enough space for one person to sleep slightly more comfortably, though that comfort is immediately claimed by Thomas the Terrible, who apparently views proximity to death as a reasonable price for additional sleeping room. The diseases that flourish in your medieval prison read like a catalog of humanity's worst biological nightmares. Dysentery spreads through the population with the efficiency of gossip, turning the already inadequate sanitation facilities into breeding grounds for bacterial infections that can kill within days. The symptoms are impossible to ignore: violent stomach cramps, bloody diarrhea, fever, and dehydration that leaves victims looking like walking skeletons before they collapse entirely. You watch strong men reduced to whimpering children as their bodies betray them in the most humiliating ways possible. The sound of groaning and retching becomes the prison's background music, a constant reminder that your digestive system could revolt at any moment. The plague makes periodic visits to your prison community, arriving without warning and departing only after claiming its tribute of human lives. The Black Death that periodically sweeps through medieval Europe shows particular fondness for overcrowded, unsanitary environments like the one you now call home. When plague symptoms appear: swollen lymph nodes, high fever, and the characteristic black spots that give the disease its name, even the guards become nervous, though they continue performing their duties with cloths tied over their faces and prayers to various saints for protection. Some prisoners develop the bubonic form, with grotesque swellings in their necks and armpits that can grow to the size of apples before bursting in fountains of infected pus. Your education in medieval medicine begins when you develop a persistent cough that produces blood-flecked phlegm and leaves you gasping for breath after minimal exertion. The prison's medical care consists of an elderly monk who visits monthly to administer last rites to dying prisoners and occasionally dispense herbal remedies that seem more likely to accelerate death than prevent it. His diagnostic technique involves examining your urine color, checking your pulse, and muttering Latin phrases that probably translate to something like, "You're definitely going to die," but God works in mysterious ways. He carries a leather satchel filled with dried herbs that smell like they've been sitting in damp storage for several decades. Medieval medical theory attributed most illnesses to imbalances in the body's four humors: blood, phlegm, yellow bile, and black bile, which could supposedly be corrected through bloodletting, purging, or dietary adjustments. Since your prison diet consists entirely of substances that would challenge the digestive systems of carrion birds, dietary therapy isn't really an option. Bloodletting involves opening veins to release excess blood, which seems counterproductive when malnutrition has already left you looking like a scarecrow. Purging involves consuming substances designed to induce vomiting and diarrhea, which appears redundant given that dysentery has already handled those functions quite thoroughly. The monk's herbal remedies reveal the gap between medieval medical theory and practical reality in prison environments. He prescribes willow bark tea for your fever, but the prison kitchen lacks the facilities to properly prepare herbal infusions. He recommends fresh air and sunlight for your respiratory problems, apparently unaware that your cell receives about as much fresh air as the inside of a sealed tomb. He suggests rest and reduced physical activity, which might be practical advice if your daily survival didn't require constant vigilance against fellow prisoners who view weakness as an invitation to violence. His medical advice is about as useful as suggesting you take a vacation to cure your imprisonment. The monk also practices a medieval medical technique called trepanation for prisoners suffering from severe headaches or mental disturbances, which involves drilling holes in the skull to release evil vapors that are supposedly causing the problems. You watch in horror as he performs this procedure on a prisoner who's been experiencing hallucinations, using what appears to be a carpenter's drill to create a neat hole in the man's forehead. The patient screams throughout the procedure, then dies 3 days later from infection, though the monk considers the operation a success because the man stopped hallucinating after losing consciousness. Historians still argue whether medieval medical practitioners genuinely believed their treatments were effective or simply performed them because patients and families expected some form of intervention. What's clear is that medieval medicine was more successful at providing psychological comfort than actual healing, operating on theories that had little basis in biological reality. The monk's visits serve primarily to reassure prisoners that their spiritual needs are being addressed, even if their physical condition continues deteriorating according to natural laws that medieval medicine couldn't begin to understand. Your respiratory condition worsens despite the monk's ministrations, developing into what modern medicine would recognize as tuberculosis but medieval medical theory attributes to corrupt air and spiritual pollution. The disease spreads through respiratory droplets, making your overcrowded cell an ideal environment for transmission from one weakened immune system to another. Soon, half the prisoners in your cell are coughing blood and struggling to breathe, creating a symphony of respiratory distress that continues day and night without relief. The sound becomes so constant that silence seems unnatural when someone finally stops coughing because they've died. The psychological impact of watching people die slowly from disease proves almost as devastating as the physical symptoms themselves. You begin to view every cough, every fever, every unusual pain as a potential death sentence, constantly monitoring your body for signs that you've contracted one of the many ailments that regularly claim prisoners. Sleep becomes elusive when you're surrounded by the sounds of suffering moaning, coughing, retching, and the occasional death rattle that signals another departure from your dwindling community. Dreams become indistinguishable from waking nightmares, filled with visions of disease and death that mirror your daily reality. Some prisoners develop what the monk calls prison fever, though whether this represents an actual disease or simply the psychological breakdown that results from prolonged exposure to hopeless conditions remains unclear. Victims become delirious, speaking to people who aren't there and experiencing hallucinations that range from pleasant visits with deceased family members to terrifying encounters with demons and monsters. The fever often proves fatal, though whether death results from the physical symptoms or from patients simply losing the will to continue living isn't always apparent. One prisoner spends 3 days convinced that invisible rats are eating his feet, screaming and clawing at his legs until he dies from exhaustion. The seasonal variations in disease patterns reveal how environmental factors influence health outcomes in your prison community. Winter brings respiratory ailments that thrive in the cold, damp conditions of unheated stone cells. The walls weep moisture constantly, creating an environment that feels like living inside a cave filled with sick people. Spring introduces new varieties of intestinal parasites as contaminated water sources begin flowing more freely. Summer creates ideal breeding conditions for insects that spread disease, with clouds of flies and mosquitoes turning the prison into a buzzing nightmare of potential infection vectors. autumn brings harvest-related illnesses as spoiled food becomes even more spoiled than usual. Your cell's sanitation situation deteriorates steadily as more prisoners become too sick to maintain even basic hygiene. The single bucket that serves as a toilet overflows regularly, creating puddles of human waste that no one has the energy or inclination to clean properly. The straw covering the floor becomes saturated with various bodily fluids, transforming into a breeding ground for bacteria and parasites that would challenge modern medical science, let alone medieval remedies involving prayer and bloodletting. Walking across the cell becomes a careful navigation exercise to avoid stepping in substances that you prefer not to identify. The water supply becomes increasingly dangerous as sick prisoners contaminate the courtyard well with runoff from their inadequate sanitation facilities. What little water you can obtain develops a taste that suggests it contains substantial quantities of substances that were never intended for human consumption. Some prisoners resort to drinking their own urine, operating on folk medicine theories that suggest recycling bodily fluids might provide essential nutrients missing from the prison diet. Whether this practice helps or hurts remains unclear, but desperation makes people willing to try approaches they would never consider under normal circumstances. Medieval understanding of disease transmission was based more on superstition than scientific observation, leading to preventive measures that ranged from ineffective to counterproductive. Some prisoners wear amulets designed to ward off disease, while others recite prayers or perform rituals intended to appease whatever supernatural forces might be responsible for their suffering. The more practical inmates focus on maintaining distance from obviously sick cellmates, though this proves impossible in quarters designed for 6 people but occupied by 30. One particularly desperate prisoner claims that sleeping with his head pointing north will protect him from disease, though this theory loses credibility when he dies of dysentery after 2 weeks of careful directional positioning. The prison's approach to epidemic disease management consists primarily of waiting for infections to run their course naturally, removing corpses when they become inconvenient, and hoping that whatever divine justice governs the universe will eventually restore order to the situation. Quarantine procedures are non-existent. Medical supplies are limited to whatever the monk carries in his small leather bag, and treatment protocols involve mainly prayer, bloodletting, and herbal remedies that seem chosen more for their availability than their effectiveness. When plague breaks out in one section of the prison, the authorities' response is to bar the doors and wait for either the disease or the prisoners to die, whichever happens first. The folk remedies that prisoners share with each other reveal the desperation that drives people to try anything that might offer hope of survival. Some believe that chewing garlic will prevent plague, leading to a thriving black market in smuggled cloves that are worth their weight in silver. Others insist that covering yourself with animal fat will protect against disease, creating an additional layer of foul odors in an environment that already challenges the limits of human olfactory endurance. A few prisoners practice a form of medieval aromatherapy, believing that pleasant smells can counteract the bad air that supposedly causes illness, though finding pleasant smells in a medieval prison presents obvious practical challenges. The religious interpretations of disease add another layer of psychological torment to the physical suffering. Many prisoners view their illnesses as divine punishment for their crimes, leading to cycles of guilt and despair that probably worsen their physical condition. The monk encourages this interpretation, suggesting that suffering purifies the soul and brings sinners closer to God's grace. Some prisoners embrace this theology enthusiastically, viewing their deteriorating health as evidence of spiritual progress, while others reject it entirely and blame their conditions on human cruelty rather than divine justice. Your own health continues declining despite your best efforts to avoid the diseases that have claimed so many of your fellow prisoners. The persistent cough that started as a minor irritation has evolved into a constant companion that leaves you gasping for breath and spitting blood with increasing frequency. Your appetite, never robust given the quality of prison food, disappears entirely as fever makes even the thought of eating nauseating. You begin to understand why so many prisoners simply give up fighting for survival, accepting death as a release from suffering rather than continuing to struggle against impossible odds. The mathematics of medieval prison mortality are sobering when you start paying attention to the numbers. In your first month, 6 prisoners died in your cell alone. In your second month, the count reached 8. By your third month, you've lost track of the exact numbers because new prisoners arrive periodically to replace the dead, creating a rotating population where faces change but suffering remains constant. The prison operates like a medieval meat grinder, processing human beings into corpses with industrial efficiency while maintaining the fiction that justice is being served. The realization that you're probably going to die in this place hits you one evening as you listen to another prisoner's death rattle echoing through the darkness. Medieval prisons weren't designed to rehabilitate criminals or even to punish them in any meaningful sense. They were simply places where society stored its unwanted members until disease, starvation, or despair eliminated them permanently. You've become part of a system designed to kill you slowly while maintaining the fiction that justice is being served and moral order is being preserved. It's like being fed into a machine designed to destroy human beings one infected cough at a time. The medieval prison hierarchy reveals itself with brutal clarity within your first week of incarceration, operating according to rules that would make a wolf pack seem civilized by comparison. You quickly discover that your cell isn't just a random collection of criminals thrown together by chance. It's a carefully structured society with its own aristocracy, middle class, and desperately poor underclass, all crammed into a space barely large enough for a modern family room. Your position in this social order was determined the moment you walked through the door, based on factors ranging from your alleged crime to your physical size to your willingness to commit violence against fellow prisoners. At the top of this twisted hierarchy sits Magnus the Strangler, a mountain of a man whose nickname supposedly comes from his preferred method of resolving disputes, though you suspect it might also refer to his approach to personal hygiene. He controls the area nearest the door, which serves as both the most strategically valuable real estate in the cell and a symbol of his dominance over the other inmates. Magnus didn't achieve his position through democratic election or natural charisma. He earned it by systematically beating every other prisoner who challenged his authority until they either submitted or stopped breathing permanently. The social structure beneath Magnus follows predictable patterns that mirror the broader medieval world, except with more immediate consequences for violating protocol. The second tier consists of prisoners who've proven their loyalty to the alpha male through various combinations of violence, useful skills, and strategic alliances. These lieutenants control specific aspects of cell life: food distribution, sleeping arrangements, entertainment, and the informal justice system that governs disputes between inmates. They've essentially created a miniature feudal system inside your prison cell, complete with lords, vassals, and serfs. Your own position in this hierarchy falls somewhere between worthless peasant and potential victim, a status that you're learning carries significant disadvantages in terms of food access, sleeping arrangements, and personal safety. As a newcomer with no particular skills, no money for bribes, and no reputation for violence, you're automatically relegated to the bottom tier of prison society until you either prove your worth or die trying. It's like starting a video game at the hardest difficulty level with no tutorial and no respawn options. The middle management of your cell consists of prisoners who've carved out specialized niches that make them valuable to the dominant hierarchy without directly challenging it. There's Willem the Rat Catcher, who maintains a monopoly on pest control services in exchange for food and protection. Big Tom the Storyteller earns his keep by providing entertainment during the long evening hours when boredom becomes almost as dangerous as hunger. Father Matthias, a defrocked priest, offers religious services and confession to prisoners who feel the need to unburden their souls before dying, accepting payment in whatever currency is available. The bottom tier of prison society consists mainly of new arrivals like yourself, elderly prisoners too weak to defend themselves, and anyone who's made the mistake of showing weakness or fear in front of the wrong people. This underclass survives on scraps and leftovers, sleeps in the worst locations, and provides labor for various projects that the upper-tier prisoners consider beneath their dignity. You're essentially living in a medieval version of social Darwinism, where survival depends on your ability to either climb the hierarchy or find ways to make yourself useful to those who control it. Medieval prison economics operate on principles that would challenge modern understanding of market forces and resource allocation. The primary currency isn't money. Most prisoners have none, but rather a complex system of favors, debts, and IOUs that track obligations between inmates. Someone might trade 3 days of cleaning duty for a share of contraband cheese, while another prisoner offers protection services in exchange for a weekly portion of bread rations. The accounting system exists entirely in people's memories, creating disputes that are typically resolved through violence rather than arbitration. The protection racket that dominates prison life represents capitalism at its most primitive and brutal. Strong prisoners offer safety from other strong prisoners in exchange for various forms of payment, creating a system where victims essentially pay their tormentors to be tormented less severely. You watch new arrivals get approached by Magnus lieutenants within hours of entering the cell, offered insurance against the random violence that characterizes daily life. The premiums are high and the coverage is limited, but the alternative is facing the prison's dangers without any allies whatsoever. Historians still argue whether medieval prison social structures developed naturally from human nature or were deliberately encouraged by authorities who believed that prisoner-on-prisoner violence reduced the likelihood of organized rebellion against the guards. What's clear is that the system effectively prevented inmates from uniting against their common oppressors, instead channeling their anger and frustration toward each other in an endless cycle of internal conflict. The sleeping arrangements in your cell reflect the rigid hierarchy that governs every aspect of prison life. Magnus and his inner circle control the driest, warmest spots near the door, using piles of straw and stolen blankets to create relatively comfortable sleeping areas. The middle tier gets adequate space but less protection from the cold stone walls and damp floor. The bottom tier, including you, sleeps wherever they can find room, often pressed against the wettest walls or in corners where drainage problems create permanent puddles of questionable substances. Your first attempt to improve your sleeping situation results in an educational encounter with the prison's informal justice system. You innocently move your small pile of straw to a spot that seems marginally less horrible than your original location, only to discover that this territory belongs to someone else who's temporarily absent on work detail. When the rightful owner returns and finds you in his space, he responds by delivering a beating that leaves you with bruised ribs and a clear understanding of property rights in medieval prison society. The violence that permeates daily life isn't random or chaotic. It follows clear patterns and serves specific social functions within the prison hierarchy. Beatings are administered for violations of unwritten rules, failure to show proper respect to higher-ranking prisoners, or simply to maintain the reputation of whoever is doing the beating. The attacks are often public spectacles designed to reinforce social order and remind everyone of their place in the pecking order. It's like living in a society where the legal system has been replaced by trial by combat, except the trials never end and there's no appeal process. The weapons available to medieval prisoners require significant creativity, since obvious implements of violence are confiscated during periodic cell searches. Enterprising inmates fashion knives from pieces of broken stone, create clubs from table legs, and manufacture garrotes from strips of cloth torn from their own clothing. Some prisoners specialize in weaponsmithing, trading their products for food and protection while maintaining their own arsenals for personal use. The guards seem aware of this underground arms industry but tolerate it as long as the violence remains directed at other prisoners rather than prison staff. The disputes that trigger violence in your cell would seem almost trivial under normal circumstances, but the stress and desperation of prison life magnify minor irritations into life-or-death conflicts. Arguments over sleeping space, food portions, or perceived signs of disrespect escalate quickly into bloodshed. Someone accused of stealing another prisoner's crust of bread might find himself fighting for his life, while a careless word about another man's family could result in a beating that leaves permanent injuries. The emotional pressure cooker of prison life transforms ordinary human interactions into potential combat situations. Your education in prison diplomacy begins when you accidentally bump into one of Magnus' lieutenants while navigating the crowded cell during feeding time. Instead of apologizing and moving on, you're expected to engage in a complex ritual of submission that involves acknowledging your inferior status, requesting permission to occupy the same space, and offering some form of compensation for the inconvenience you've caused. Failure to perform this ritual correctly could result in immediate violence, while overperforming it might mark you as weak and invite future exploitation. The information economy in your cell operates alongside the physical economy, with knowledge serving as another form of currency that can be traded for favors and protection. Prisoners who know about upcoming guard rotations, plan cell searches, or opportunities for contraband smuggling can exchange this intelligence for better food, safer sleeping arrangements, or assistance with personal vendettas. You begin to understand that survival requires not just physical toughness but also political awareness and strategic thinking. The sexual dynamics within your medieval prison add another layer of complexity to an already intricate social system. Stronger prisoners claim weaker ones as personal property, offering protection in exchange for sexual services and complete submission. These relationships aren't romantic partnerships but rather feudal arrangements that mirror the broader prison hierarchy. The victims often cooperate willingly because the alternative being available to anyone who wants them is even worse than belonging exclusively to a single powerful protector. Your own vulnerability in this system becomes apparent when Magnus himself approaches you during your second week, explaining with surprising gentleness that you need someone to look after you in this dangerous environment. His offer of protection comes with clearly understood conditions that make your stomach turn, but refusing might result in immediate violence from either Magnus himself or other prisoners who view rejection of such offers as insulting to the entire hierarchy. You're learning that medieval prison life forces people to make choices that would be unthinkable under normal circumstances. The entertainment that prisoners create to pass the endless hours reveals both human creativity and the depths of desperation that characterize medieval prison life. Magnus organizes fighting tournaments where prisoners beat each other senseless for the amusement of spectators and the chance to win extra food rations. These contests aren't sporting events but rather gladiatorial combat designed to provide excitement in an environment where death is the most interesting thing that ever happens. The winners achieve temporary celebrity status and improved social standing, while the losers often require medical attention that isn't available. The psychological toll of living within this brutal hierarchy becomes apparent as you watch fellow prisoners gradually lose their humanity in the struggle to survive. Men who might have been decent, caring individuals in their previous lives become calculating predators who view every interaction through the lens of potential advantage or threat. The prison environment systematically strips away the social conditioning that allows civilization to function, revealing the primitive survival instincts that lurk beneath the surface of human nature. Your gradual adaptation to this social system represents both a victory and a defeat. You're learning to navigate the complex relationships that govern prison life, but you're also becoming someone you wouldn't recognize from your previous existence. The moral compromises required for survival are changing you in fundamental ways, eroding the ethical principles that once guided your decisions and replacing them with pragmatic calculations about power, violence, and self-preservation. You're discovering that medieval prisons don't just confine bodies, they transform souls in ways that make eventual release almost irrelevant. The screaming that echoes from the lower levels of the prison becomes your introduction to the medieval art of extracting confessions through creative applications of pain and terror. You initially assume these sounds must be coming from wild animals kept somewhere in the building's depths, because surely no human being could produce such inhuman wails of agony. But Thomas the Terrible, remember that charming fellow from your cell? Cheerfully explains that those are just the daily interrogation sessions, where prisoners suspected of additional crimes or escape attempts receive special attention from the prison's confession specialists. Medieval torture wasn't just about inflicting pain, it was a sophisticated psychological and physical system designed to break down human resistance in the most efficient way possible. The torturer's craft involved understanding exactly how much suffering a person could endure before dying, then keeping them at that precise threshold for extended periods while encouraging them to provide whatever information the authorities wanted to hear. It was like a twisted form of medieval medicine, except instead of healing patients, practitioners specialized in methodically destroying them while keeping them alive enough to talk. Your first direct encounter with the prison's interrogation facilities comes sooner than you'd hoped. When guards arrive at your cell one morning and announce that Magnus the Strangler is wanted for questioning about a knife that was found hidden in the straw. The big man who's dominated your cell since your arrival suddenly looks smaller and more vulnerable as iron shackles clamp around his wrists and ankles. His departure creates a power vacuum that immediately triggers a struggle for control among his former lieutenants. But the sounds echoing from below suggest that Magnus has more immediate concerns than prison politics. The torture chamber occupies the lowest level of the prison, carved directly into the bedrock beneath the main building like a medieval basement designed by someone with serious psychological problems. The thick stone walls muffle sounds effectively enough that screams barely penetrate to the upper levels, though they can't completely contain the echoes of human suffering that seem to seep through the very stones. The location serves practical purposes. Torture victims can't be heard by outside observers, and the isolation reinforces the sense that prisoners have been completely cut off from civilized society. Medieval interrogation techniques represented centuries of accumulated knowledge about human anatomy, psychology, and the relationship between pain and compliance. The Spanish boot, designed to crush foot bones gradually, could reduce a strong man to pleading confession within minutes. The rack stretched victims' joints beyond their natural limits, often permanently dislocating shoulders and hips while encouraging honest communication. The pair of anguish, inserted into various body orifices and then expanded, provided motivation for truthfulness that most people found impossible to ignore. The thumbscrew became the torture device of choice for many medieval interrogators because of its simplicity and effectiveness. This instrument consisted of metal plates connected by screws that could be tightened gradually, crushing thumbs and fingers with precisely controlled pressure. The victim could watch their own bones being slowly destroyed while maintaining the hope that cooperation might stop the process before permanent damage occurred. It was psychological warfare combined with physical destruction, designed to break the spirit as thoroughly as it shattered bones. Your education in medieval pain management continues when Magnus returns to your cell 3 days later, barely recognizable as the dominant figure who'd controlled every aspect of prison life. His hands are wrapped in blood-stained rags that can't completely hide his mangled fingers, and he moves with the careful, measured steps of someone whose joints no longer function properly. But more disturbing than his physical injuries is the blank, hollow expression in his eyes, the look of someone whose spirit has been systematically dismantled along with his body. The confession that Magnus provided under torture reveals the arbitrary nature of medieval justice and the circular logic that governed interrogation procedures. He admitted to plotting an escape, planning to murder several guards, attempting to organize a prisoner rebellion, and maintaining secret communications with criminal associates outside the prison. Whether any of these confessions reflect actual activities or simply represent whatever the torturers wanted to hear remains unclear, but Magnus' detailed admissions provide justification for additional punishments and extended imprisonment. Historians still argue whether medieval torture actually produced reliable information or simply generated whatever confessions authorities wanted to obtain. What's clear is that the practice served important political functions beyond information gathering, demonstrating the state's power to inflict unlimited suffering on anyone who challenged its authority. The public nature of many torture procedures conducted in courtyards or town squares where citizens could observe served as community education about the consequences of antisocial behavior. The psychological techniques used by medieval interrogators were often more effective than purely physical torture. exploiting human emotional vulnerabilities with surgical precision. Threatening to torture a prisoner's family members could produce faster confessions than actually torturing the prisoner himself. Describing in graphic detail what would happen during upcoming torture sessions often broke resistance before any actual pain was inflicted. Some victims confessed simply to avoid the anticipation and uncertainty that preceded formal interrogation procedures. The religious dimensions of medieval torture added layers of spiritual torment to the physical suffering, as interrogators claimed to be saving souls through the purification of pain. Church authorities developed theological justifications for torture that portrayed suffering as a necessary step toward redemption, making confession both legally and spiritually beneficial for victims. The presence of priests during torture sessions provided religious legitimacy for procedures that might otherwise seem inconsistent with Christian teachings about mercy and forgiveness. Your cell's new power structure emerges from the chaos following Magnus' return. Though the previous alpha male no longer possesses the physical or psychological resources to maintain his dominant position. Willem the Rat Catcher assumes temporary leadership through a combination of strategic alliances and careful violence, though everyone understands that his authority remains provisional until someone stronger decides to challenge it. The transition demonstrates how quickly medieval social hierarchies could collapse when key figures were removed or incapacitated. The tools of medieval torture represented sophisticated engineering applied to the problem of maximum human suffering with minimum risk of immediate death. The Iron Maiden, despite being largely mythical, captured popular imagination because it embodied the perfect torture device, one that could inflict enormous pain while allowing precise control over the timing and extent of injuries. Real devices like the Judas Cradle achieved similar results through simpler means, using gravity and body weight to create unbearable pressure on sensitive areas while giving victims some control over the rate of their own destruction. The professional torturers who staffed medieval interrogation facilities possessed specialized knowledge that made them valuable employees despite the unsavory nature of their work. These specialists understood human anatomy well enough to avoid accidentally killing prisoners before extracting desired confessions, while also knowing how to inflict maximum psychological impact through carefully targeted physical damage. Some torturers achieved celebrity status for their expertise, traveling between jurisdictions to handle particularly challenging cases that required advanced techniques. Your first personal summons to the torture chamber arrives during your second month of imprisonment, when guards inform you that authorities have questions about your activities before arrest. The walk down stone steps carved into living rock feels like descending into the underworld, with each level deeper and darker than the last. The temperature drops noticeably as you descend, while the air becomes thick with moisture and unidentifiable odors that suggest you're approaching something fundamentally different from normal human spaces. The interrogation chamber itself exceeds your worst expectations, filled with devices that look like they were designed by someone who spent considerable time thinking about creative ways to dismantle human bodies. Chains hang from the ceiling at various heights, while tables equipped with restraints and mechanical devices occupy the center of the room. The walls display an array of tools that range from simple clubs to elaborate contraptions whose functions you prefer not to contemplate. It's like a medieval hardware store specializing in suffering, where every item has been specifically designed to cause maximum pain with minimum permanent damage. The head torturer introduces himself with the casual professionalism of someone explaining routine business procedures, describing the various techniques available and their relative advantages for different types of information extraction. He explains that cooperation during the early stages of questioning will be rewarded with gentler treatment, while resistance will necessitate progression through increasingly unpleasant persuasion methods. His tone suggests he genuinely views this as a customer service interaction, where your satisfaction depends entirely on how quickly you provide the products he's looking for. The questioning begins with seemingly innocent inquiries about your life before imprisonment, your family, your work, your relationships with neighbors and local authorities. But the interrogator's real interest becomes clear as he probes for information about other potential criminals who might have escaped justice, additional crimes you might have committed, and your knowledge of illegal activities in your village. The medieval justice system operated on the assumption that every criminal was connected to a broader network of antisocial behavior that could be uncovered through properly motivated questioning. Your attempts to maintain innocence are met with patient explanations about the futility of resistance and the benefits of honest communication. The torturer describes in clinical detail how each device in the room functions, the types of injuries it typically produces, and the average time required to achieve various levels of confession. His educational approach transforms the interrogation into a nightmarish seminar on applied human suffering, where you're both student and experimental subject in a curriculum designed to break your will to resist. The actual application of torture begins with relatively mild techniques designed to demonstrate the torturer's capabilities without immediately incapacitating you. The thumbscrew provides an introduction to precisely controlled pain that starts as uncomfortable pressure and escalates to bone-crushing agony as the metal plates tighten. You discover that torture isn't a sudden shock, but rather a gradual process that allows plenty of time to contemplate your situation and consider the benefits of cooperation. The psychological aspects of torture prove as devastating as the physical pain, as you're forced to participate in your own destruction by choosing between different types of suffering. The torturer offers you selections from his menu of persuasion techniques, allowing you to decide whether you prefer joint manipulation, pressure point application, or creative uses of heat and cold. These choices create an illusion of control while actually reinforcing your helplessness, as every option leads to the same destination through different routes of agony. Your eventual confession extracted after what feels like hours, but was probably only minutes of actual torture, includes detailed admissions to crimes you never committed, knowledge of criminal networks that don't exist, and information about escape plans you never considered. The content of your confession seems less important than the fact that you're confessing at all, providing authorities with whatever narrative they want to hear while demonstrating the effectiveness of their interrogation techniques. You've become another success story in the medieval torture industry, proof that the right combination of pain and fear can extract any desired information from the human spirit. The first escape attempt you witness happens during your 3rd month of imprisonment, when a desperate poacher named Benedict decides that certain death is preferable to slow starvation. His plan demonstrates the kind of optimism that only develops when prolonged suffering has damaged someone's ability to think rationally about cause and effect. Benedict's strategy involves digging through the stone floor of your cell using a spoon he somehow acquired, apparently believing that several feet of solid rock can be excavated with kitchen utensils and determination. The physics of his plan are questionable, but you have to admire his commitment to the project. Medieval prison architecture was specifically designed to make escape virtually impossible, though this didn't stop desperate prisoners from attempting increasingly creative solutions to their confinement problems. The walls of your prison rise 40 feet above ground level and extend an unknown distance into the bedrock below, creating a vertical maze that would challenge modern rock climbers equipped with proper gear. The few windows are narrow slits positioned too high to reach and too small for human passage, while the doors are reinforced with iron bands that could probably stop a charging bull, let alone an undernourished prisoner with improvised tools. Benedict's excavation project becomes a source of entertainment for your cellmates, who offer helpful suggestions about digging techniques while secretly wagering on how long it will take the guards to discover his activities. The hole he creates after 2 weeks of nighttime digging measures approximately 6 inches deep and would need to extend roughly 20 feet to reach anything resembling an escape route. At his current rate of progress, he'll achieve freedom sometime during the next century, assuming he doesn't die of old age or tunnel collapse before completing the project. The guard who discovers Benedict's escape tunnel reacts with the kind of professional amusement that comes from years of watching prisoners attempt impossible tasks. He examines the pathetic hole, compliments Benedict on his dedication to the project, and then systematically beats him unconscious with a wooden club while explaining that escape attempts violate prison regulations. Benedict's punishment serves as community education for the rest of your cellmates, demonstrating that even laughably impractical escape plans carry serious consequences for their perpetrators. Medieval escape attempts typically fell into several categories, each with its own advantages and corresponding methods of spectacular failure. Tunneling projects like Benedict's were popular because they offered the psychological comfort of making progress toward freedom, even when that progress was measured in fractions of inches per night. Climbing attempts involved scaling walls that were designed by people who understood the relationship between height and gravity better than most prisoners understood the relationship between desperation and physics. Violence-based escapes required overpowering armed guards while weakened by malnutrition and disease, which rarely ended well for the prisoners involved. Your education in escape methodology continues when you meet Crafty Pete, a long-term prisoner who claims to have attempted escape 14 separate times using various innovative approaches. His catalog of failures reads like a medieval version of a physics textbook, covering topics such as why rope made from clothing tears under body weight and the relationship between prison wall height and human bone durability. Pete's expertise in unsuccessful escape techniques makes him a valuable consultant for other prisoners planning their own doomed adventures in creative problem-solving. The rope escape represents the most popular method among prisoners who possess basic understanding of knot tying but lack advanced knowledge of tensile strength and weight distribution. Crafty Pete's third escape attempt involved creating a rope from torn clothing and bedding materials, which he used to rappel from a window in the prison's upper level. The improvised rope held his weight for approximately 8 feet before unraveling and depositing him in the courtyard with 2 broken legs and a renewed appreciation for the importance of quality control in rope manufacturing. Medieval prisoners who attempted escape through disguise demonstrated remarkable creativity combined with fundamental misunderstanding of how human recognition actually works. Pete's 7th escape attempt involved dressing as a guard using stolen clothing and walking confidently toward the main gate, apparently believing that clothing alone would transform him into someone authorized to leave the premises. His disguise lasted until he reached the first actual guard, who recognized him immediately and expressed professional appreciation for the entertainment value of his performance. The tunnel escape that actually succeeded in your prison's history involved 3 prisoners who spent 18 months excavating a passage that extended beyond the outer walls. Their project required sophisticated engineering, including timber supports to prevent collapse, ventilation systems to provide breathable air, and disposal methods for the tons of rock and earth they removed. The tunnel represented medieval prison escape at its most ambitious, requiring the kind of planning and execution that could have built cathedrals if applied to legitimate construction projects. Historians still argue whether the successful tunnel escape was actually an escape or simply an elaborate form of suicide, since the 3 prisoners were never seen again and may have died from cave-ins, suffocation, or exposure in the wilderness surrounding the prison. Medieval escape plans typically failed to account for survival requirements after leaving prison, such as food, shelter, navigation, and the small matter of avoiding recapture by authorities who took escape attempts personally and responded with corresponding enthusiasm. Your own escape fantasies develop gradually as you watch other prisoners attempt various impossible schemes and suffer the inevitable consequences. The mental exercise of planning an escape provides psychological relief from the daily horrors of prison life, allowing you to imagine scenarios where cleverness and determination triumph over stone walls and armed guards. These fantasies become increasingly elaborate as your imprisonment continues, though they remain safely in the realm of imagination where physics and human nature are more cooperative than they prove to be in reality. The punishment for attempted escape varied depending on the creativity of the attempt, the damage caused during the process, and the mood of whoever was responsible for determining appropriate consequences. Simple escape attempts might result in beatings, extended imprisonment, or assignment to harsher work details. More elaborate schemes could trigger formal torture sessions designed to extract information about accomplices and future plans. The most ambitious escape attempts sometimes resulted in public executions that served as community education about the futility of challenging established authority. Medieval prison security relied heavily on the physical impossibility of escape rather than sophisticated surveillance or detection systems. The massive stone construction, strategic location, and sheer vertical challenges created environments where escape attempts were essentially self-defeating. Guards could afford to be relatively relaxed about security because the architecture did most of their work for them, though they remained alert for attempts that might damage prison property or provide entertainment for staff and other prisoners. The social dynamics surrounding escape attempts reveal important aspects of medieval prison culture and the psychology of confinement. Successful escapes were celebrated by remaining prisoners as victories against the system, even when escapees were recaptured and punished severely. Failed attempts provided entertainment and cautionary lessons while reinforcing the sense that freedom was impossible to achieve through individual effort. The mythology surrounding escape attempts became part of prison folklore, with stories growing more elaborate and heroic with each retelling. Your cellmate Willem, the rat catcher, claims to have assisted with several escape attempts by providing intelligence about guard schedules, architectural weaknesses, and supply opportunities. His services as an escape consultant demonstrate the specialized knowledge that long-term prisoners accumulated about their environment. Though his perfect record of failure suggests that information alone wasn't sufficient to overcome the fundamental challenges of medieval prison architecture. Willem's expertise in unsuccessful escape methodology makes him popular among new prisoners who haven't yet learned to distinguish between experience and competence. The tools available for escape attempts were limited to whatever prisoners could improvise from available materials or steal from guards and work details. Spoons could be sharpened into digging implements, clothing could be woven into rope, and metal fragments could serve as lock picks for the mechanically inclined. The guards periodically searched cells for contraband and escape materials, though their inspections were often cursory and focused more on weapons than on construction tools. Medieval security operated on the assumption that escape was impossible regardless of what tools prisoners might acquire. The timing of escape attempts typically coincided with seasonal factors that affected both opportunity and survival prospects. Spring and summer offered better weather for outdoor survival but also provided longer daylight hours that made detection more likely. Winter escapes faced harsh weather that could kill fugitives even if they successfully left the prison, while autumn attempts had to account for shortened days that reduced available working time for tunnel excavation or wall climbing projects. Your own contemplation of escape possibilities leads to the sobering realization that medieval prisons were essentially one-way institutions designed to hold people until death released them from their obligations to the justice system. The few successful escapes in prison history were statistical anomalies rather than proof that determined prisoners could overcome architectural and logistical obstacles through cleverness and effort. The mathematics of escape were fundamentally stacked against prisoners, who had to succeed at every step of complex, dangerous plans while guards only had to catch them making a single mistake. The psychological impact of failed escape attempts extends beyond the immediate participants to affect the entire prison population, reinforcing the sense of helplessness and futility that characterizes medieval imprisonment. Each spectacular failure provides evidence that resistance is pointless and that acceptance of confinement represents the most rational response to circumstances beyond individual control. The escape attempts become part of prison theater, dramatic performances that entertain audiences while confirming that the existing order cannot be challenged successfully by desperate individuals with improvised tools and impossible dreams. Your gradual abandonment of escape fantasies represents both a psychological defeat and a practical adaptation to reality, as you learn to focus your limited energy on daily survival rather than impossible schemes for liberation. The medieval prison system achieves its ultimate victory not through preventing escape attempts but through convincing prisoners that freedom is no longer worth pursuing, transforming defiant individuals into compliant inmates who accept their fate and wait patiently for death to provide the only release that stone walls cannot prevent. The approaching winter of your first year in the stone hellscape brings with it a creeping realization that has been lurking at the edges of your consciousness since your arrival. You are probably never going to leave this place alive. The mathematics of medieval imprisonment are brutally simple. Most prisoners enter through the main gate and exit through the morgue cart, with very few taking any alternative routes between those two destinations. Your fellow inmates have begun treating you with the weary familiarity reserved for permanent residents rather than temporary visitors, and you're starting to understand why that familiarity feels so ominous. Medieval prisons weren't designed as temporary holding facilities where criminals served predetermined sentences before returning to society as reformed citizens. They functioned more like human disposal systems, places where inconvenient people were stored until natural causes, disease, violence, or deliberate execution removed them from the roles of the living. The concept of rehabilitation didn't exist in any meaningful sense. Authorities assumed that people who ended up in prison were fundamentally defective and unlikely to contribute positively to society even if released. Your imprisonment isn't a punishment with a defined endpoint. It's a death sentence with an indefinite timeline. The seasonal rhythm of death in your prison follows patterns that would fascinate medieval statisticians if such people existed and had access to reliable record-keeping systems. Winter brings respiratory diseases that claim prisoners whose immune systems have been weakened by malnutrition and constant stress. Spring introduces intestinal ailments as contaminated water sources begin flowing more freely after the thaw. Summer creates perfect breeding conditions for insects that spread plague and other epidemic diseases. Autumn brings a final harvest of mortality as accumulated health problems reach crisis points before the cycle begins again. Your cellmate Thomas the Terrible explains the prison's informal mortality statistics with the casual expertise of someone who's watched countless people die over multiple years of incarceration. According to his calculations, roughly half of new arrivals die within their first year, while most of the survivors succumb during their second or third years as accumulated health problems overwhelm their weakened bodies. The few prisoners who manage to survive longer than 5 years typically do so by achieving positions in the prison hierarchy that provide access to better food, safer sleeping arrangements, and protection from violence. The record holder for longevity in your prison is apparently old Marcus, a political prisoner who's been incarcerated for 12 years and achieved legendary status among inmates for his survival skills and institutional knowledge. Marcus occupies a privileged position in the prison's social hierarchy, serving as an elder statesman who mediates disputes and provides advice to newer prisoners about survival strategies. His continued existence proves that long-term survival is theoretically possible, though his gaunt appearance and persistent cough suggest that even he is fighting a losing battle against the cumulative effects of prolonged imprisonment. The causes of death in medieval prisons encompass virtually every way that human beings can stop living, from violent altercations between prisoners to mysterious illnesses that resist both medical treatment and folk remedies. Starvation claims prisoners whose families stop sending food packages or who lose their positions in the informal economy that governs resource distribution. Disease accounts for the largest percentage of mortality, with epidemics periodically sweeping through the population like medieval versions of natural disasters. Violence provides a more immediate but less predictable cause of death, ranging from planned murders to spontaneous fights that escalate beyond anyone's ability to control. Your own health continues its gradual decline despite your best efforts to maintain physical condition through whatever exercise is possible in your cramped quarters. The persistent cough that developed during your third month has evolved into a constant companion that leaves you breathless after minimal exertion and occasionally produces blood-flecked phlegm that suggests serious damage to your respiratory system. Your appetite has disappeared almost entirely, though this might be considered an adaptation rather than a problem given the quality of food available. Sleep comes fitfully when it comes at all, interrupted by pain, cold, and the sounds of suffering that never completely fade into background noise. The psychological transformation that accompanies physical deterioration proves equally disturbing as you watch yourself becoming someone you wouldn't recognize from your previous life. The moral principles that once guided your decisions have been replaced by survival calculations that prioritize immediate needs over abstract ethical considerations. You've learned to ignore the suffering of fellow prisoners when intervention might jeopardize your own safety, to hoard resources that could help others, and to view violence as a legitimate tool for resolving disputes when other methods prove ineffective. Medieval prison administrators kept minimal records of prisoner mortality, partly because literacy was limited and partly because authorities didn't consider inmate deaths particularly noteworthy events requiring detailed documentation. Most prisons maintained simple tallies of arrivals and departures, with deaths typically recorded as single-line entries that noted the prisoner's name, alleged crime, and date of expiration. The lack of detailed medical records means that historians still argue about the primary causes of mortality in medieval detention facilities, though malnutrition and disease clearly accounted for the majority of deaths. The disposal of corpses in your prison follows procedures that reflect medieval attitudes toward convicted criminals and the sanctity of human remains. Dead prisoners are removed from cells when their bodies begin to pose health hazards to surviving inmates, typically within a day or two of death depending on guard schedules and workload priorities. The corpses are wrapped in whatever cloth is available, usually torn bedding or clothing stripped from other prisoners, and transported to mass graves located outside the prison walls where they're buried without ceremony or individual markers. The families of deceased prisoners rarely receive notification of deaths or information about burial locations, operating on the assumption that people who commit crimes have severed their connections to civilized society and forfeited their rights to normal social considerations. Some families hire priests to say masses for deceased prisoners' souls, though these religious observances are typically conducted without the bodies present and serve more to comfort surviving relatives than to benefit the dead. The medieval justice system treated criminal death as the administrative detail rather than a human tragedy worthy of compassionate response. Your gradual acceptance of your own likely death represents both a psychological defense mechanism and a realistic assessment of statistical probabilities. The fantasy of eventual release has been replaced by more modest goal: surviving another day, avoiding violence, finding enough food to maintain basic bodily functions. These short-term objectives provide structure for daily existence while avoiding the despair that would accompany honest assessment of long-term prospects. You're learning to live in a state of suspended animation where the future extends only as far as the next meal or the next night's sleep. The conversations among long-term prisoners reveal how people adapt psychologically to the prospect of dying in confinement, developing philosophical frameworks that make imprisonment bearable by redefining concepts like freedom, success, and meaningful existence. Some prisoners embrace religious interpretations that view suffering as purification for past sins, while others adopt fatalistic philosophies that treat death as a welcome release from unbearable conditions. A few maintain elaborate fantasy lives involving imaginary escapes, family reunions, and return to normal society, though these fantasies become increasingly disconnected from reality as imprisonment continues. Historians still debate whether medieval imprisonment was intentionally designed to kill prisoners or simply reflected the general incompetence and indifference that characterized most medieval institutions. What's clear is that authorities showed little interest in maintaining prisoner health or ensuring that sentences could be served successfully, suggesting that death was viewed as an acceptable and perhaps even desirable outcome of the incarceration process. The medieval justice system operated on the assumption that society benefited more from the permanent removal of criminals than from their eventual rehabilitation and return to community life. The legal framework surrounding prisoner mortality reveals medieval attitudes toward criminal justice and the value of human life under different social circumstances. Prison deaths were rarely investigated unless they involved violence against guards or damage to prison property, suggesting that authorities viewed inmate mortality as a natural consequence of criminal behavior rather than a failure of institutional management. Families of deceased prisoners had no legal recourse for demanding better conditions or compensation for wrongful death, since criminals were assumed to have accepted responsibility for whatever consequences resulted from their crimes. Your own contemplation of mortality becomes a daily meditation as you watch your body gradually failing and your psychological resources slowly depleting. The fear of death has been replaced by a kind of tired curiosity about when and how the end will come, whether through disease, violence, starvation, or simply the accumulated stress of existing under impossible conditions. This acceptance doesn't represent peace or spiritual enlightenment, but rather the emotional numbness that develops when hope becomes more painful than despair. The winter cold that seeps through the stone walls of your cell brings with it a bone-deep chill that no amount of shared body heat can completely dispel. Your breath forms clouds in the frigid air, while moisture from your exhalations freezes on the walls in delicate patterns that would be beautiful under different circumstances. The cold becomes another enemy in your daily struggle for survival, draining energy that's already in short supply and creating additional stress for bodily systems that are already operating beyond their sustainable limits. The sounds of the prison change as winter deepens and more prisoners succumb to the combined pressures of cold, hunger, disease, and despair. The constant background noise of coughing, moaning, and restless movement gives way to longer periods of silence punctuated by occasional cries of pain or fear. The morning ritual of checking which cellmates survived the night becomes a grim form of attendance-taking, with empty spaces in the straw marking the departure of people whose names you're already beginning to forget. As you drift toward sleep on what might be one of your final nights in this medieval nightmare, your thoughts turn not to escape or rescue but to the strange peace that comes with accepting the inevitable. The stone walls that once seemed like barriers now feel almost protective, sheltering you from a world that clearly has no place for someone like you. Your breathing slows as the cold settles deeper into your bones, and the sounds of suffering around you fade into a gentle whisper that might be the wind through the prison corridors, or might be the voices of those who've already made the journey you're about to take. The medieval prison has achieved its ultimate purpose not to punish or reform, but to slowly and systematically erase you from the world of the living, transforming you from a person with hopes and dreams into a statistic in some clerk's ledger of administrative business concluded. In this final accounting, you're discovering that the true horror of medieval imprisonment wasn't the brutality or the disease or the violence, but the patient, methodical way it stripped away everything that made life worth living until death seemed not like an ending but like a long overdue beginning. Your eyes close as the winter darkness settles over the prison like a blanket, and your last conscious thought is a quiet gratitude that the struggle is finally, mercifully, almost over. The stone walls that have witnessed countless similar endings stand silent witness to another small tragedy in the vast machinery of medieval justice, where human beings were processed like grain through a mill that produced nothing but suffering, despair, and the eventual peace that comes when even suffering becomes too much effort to sustain. The medieval world moves on without you, as it moved on without Henrik and Benedict and Magnus and all the others whose names are already fading from memory. The prison fills with new prisoners who will discover the same truths you've learned about survival, hierarchy, disease, and death. The cycle continues with mechanical precision, grinding fresh hopes into familiar despair, while the stone walls grow older and stronger with each passing season, weathered by time but unchanged in their fundamental purpose of containing human misery until mortality provides the only release that medieval justice was ever designed to offer. In the end, the medieval prison doesn't just confine your body, it reclaims your very existence, reducing you from a person with a name and a history to an anonymous casualty in humanity's long, slow struggle against the forces that seek to break the human spirit. And in that final transformation, you discover the last lesson that this place has to teach, that sometimes the greatest victory isn't survival, but simply the quiet dignity of refusing to let cruelty and suffering steal your essential humanity, even as life itself slips away like breath in the winter air. Sweet dreams, and may your rest be more peaceful than your final days in this medieval monument to human cruelty and institutional indifference.